Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alexandra Torné, PhD student from the University of Geneva, and I'll be talking now about a study we're making on the distributional impacts of policy mixes to decarbonize the residential sector on key societal actors in Switzerland. It's not a complete study, but we're already able to share the methodology and some preliminary analysis of results. So your feedback at this stage is more than welcome. Despite the large greenhouse gas emissions of the residential sector that we've been presented today, an energy efficiency gap remains, and which can be broadly described as a slower than cost-optimal adoption of low-carbon technologies and energy efficiency measures. And to bridge this gap, many studies in different contexts we will have found that we will need stringent and coordinated mixes of demand-side policy instruments that also contain regulation. But there's some work to be done on the ex-ante quantitative evaluations of these type of policies. More focus has to be put on quantitatively evaluating policy mixes rather than just standalone policy instruments, as the interaction between instruments shape their marginal effects, and also on accurately representing policy design rather than including too stylized policies. So more work has to be done on capturing multiple policy impacts and trade-offs between these. There's now an emergent literature on distributional impacts, on distributional justice, because it's especially important for social, political acceptance, thereby policy implementation at the end. And from a modeling perspective, models that quantitatively evaluate these types of policies have to further consider heterogeneity from a technical perspective, including the multiple types of investments that that dwelling owners can make, and also their diverse investment behavior. We try to work on some of these gaps in the case of Switzerland, and try to answer these three research questions. First one, given the legacy infrastructure and aversion to investments of the Swiss residential sector, how do different ambitious energy policy mixes compare in terms of mitigation effectiveness? Then what are the trade-offs between these effectiveness, public budget costs as well, and some economic impacts across key actors? And then what are the distributional impacts of the policy mixes across some household groups? This is essentially what we do is we take a small set of ambitious policy mixes. I'll go more on this more on detail on this later, and we evaluate the effect they have on the investments from 2025 to 2050 of a representative sample of Swiss households that we built mainly from survey data. And based on the results across the same sample, we evaluate the mixes regarding effectiveness, net public spending as total subsidies minus taxes in this period. And we also evaluate some economic impacts, for instance, the total revenues from these investments that go to the construction industry, also for operation and maintenance. The revenues that go to utilities from heating, fuel, and electricity sales, and the total investments that need to be raised by owner-occupiers of dwellings and also landlords. And then we also try to measure the effect that these policy mixes have on the long-term costs for both electricity and heating for some household groups. These are the policy instruments we include in our mixes. In one side, we have three regulation-based instruments with two levels each. The base level is a model regulation in Switzerland that then, because it's a federal state, cantons or Swiss states can decide whether to implement or not. And then a second level that it's more ambitious than that. For instance, we have proposed bans on installing electric, gas, and oil boilers and on using these boilers after 2050. We also simulate bans on these new boilers and on using them earlier on, after 2035. Then the proposed obligation to install PV panels when roofs are renovated, and also to have PV panels installed in all buildings before 2035. Then the last regulation we include is the obligation to retrofit the envelopes of either old and very inefficient dwellings or of all inefficient dwellings or more dwellings. And all these two before 2035, and this is enforced in waves. Then we include incentives or price-based instruments in the shape of one-time subsidies for low-carbon heating, renewable generation, and retrofits, taxes on heating fuels, and then some protection measures from regulation for dwellings with occupants at risk of poverty. Here you have the definition, and in the shape of exemptions or compared to the rest of dwellings, additional subsidies. We don't simulate all possible combinations of these instrument levels. We first filter out a set based on what we think consistent with current debates. For instance, we don't include policy mixes that, for starters, can be perceived as more expensive, because the current debates now in Switzerland are to reduce support for climate actions rather than to increase it. And then out of this set, we select a smaller subset of maximally diverse mixes to give a sense a bit of the possibilities out there. And for that, basically we codify the instrument levels as numbers and have a baseline scenario of proposed regulation with current incentives, and then find the most different one with measuring some distances, and then we try to find scenarios in the middle iteratively that are the most different to the already selected set. With this method we select these policy mixes. We have the baseline with proposed regulation, current incentives, up to a most different one with stricter versions of this regulation, higher taxes and lower subsidies overall, and then some mixes in the middle. One, for instance, that tries to balance the budget with only higher taxes and lower subsidies. And to compare all these, we also include one without any regulation, just with incentives. In this study, we take a dynamic micro-simulation approach and simulate the effect that the policy mixes have on the investments that either owner-occupiers or landlords must make from 2025 to 2050 when equipment expires or when regulation is enforced, as you can see an example here. For envelope retrofits, we consider three retrofit depths, with or without ventilation with heat recovery. Households also can replace their current heating system with multiple options, with also solar thermal collectors as a complement, and install a PV system with or without batteries. And we model their behavior, yes, with the objective of minimizing cost, but with an empirical hurdle rate or implicit discount rate of 15%, which is found to be to adequately describe the historic investment the decision in Switzerland for specifically this type of investments. And we take this from a previous study. This is the first set of results. And here you can see the emissions promoted by all the policy mixes. Here we include emissions from heating fuel and electricity use, and also the embodied emissions in new investments. Basically, we see that even without regulation, with this aversion to investments of dwelling owners, and with this legacy infrastructure that takes some time to replace, with current incentives, and also with the parallel assumed decarbonization of Swiss electricity, there's some emissions reductions that we can expect, but of course, regulation, proposed regulation to retrofit dwellings before 2035, or forbidding the installation of new oil and gas and electric boilers and PV obligations, this can ramp down significant emissions. And you can see this in blue, that's the baseline scenario. Then if you go for stricter versions of the regulation that force investments before 2035, you achieve about the same emissions in 2050, but you save a lot of emissions along the way. This can be explained by the evolution of heating system capacities that you can see across the different scenarios. As you can see, without regulation, oil and to some extent gas boilers survive till 2050, but forbidding new boilers of this kind slowly ramps down their capacities towards 2050. But of course, if you want to achieve greater emissions, you have to go for the very stringent measure of banning their use before 2035. Here we have the evolution of the consumption of the different energy carriers. This might seem counterintuitive, but electricity consumptions from households go down, and this is because we don't assume here the electrification of transport. Also, electricity that goes to heat pumps for district heating doesn't fall in this category, and because there's more PV installations, phase out of oil boilers, retrofits in parallel of this. So that explains a bit this finding, and then we can see that district heating becomes supply becomes more important. Regarding other investments, without regulation, we can expect some, assuming behaviors as in the past, we can expect some degree of retrofit savings, but of course, here you see the extent to which obligating retrofits can ramp up energy savings. And if we compare the baseline, for instance, with the green scenario, you can see the difference that exemptions make. For PV deployment, it's a bit the same. You have a first group of scenarios that oblige PV when renovating roofs, but there's a comparatively much faster and deployment of, and to a higher extent, deployment of PV with making it mandatory for all dwellings before 2035. And you can see here that batteries become only appealing at the later years with reduced investment costs, higher electricity prices that we assume, and that they are attractive, especially with more subsidies. This was for effectiveness. Here we also plot the rest of policy mix outcomes, cumulative from 2025 to 2050, and you have the different policy mixes. This is a parallel lines plot, and you have best outcomes on top, worst in the bottom, and we can see some trade-offs, for instance, of implementing regulation versus not implementing regulation, climate action versus climate inaction. And we see that, yes, regulation leads to a bunch of emission savings, about half from the most effective scenario. Another positive thing, it raises revenues for the construction industry. But of course, this requires more investment by dwelling owners. They would otherwise invest in other things that are less expensive or not invest, and can require more public spending unless subsidies are reduced, and especially with stricter regulation and maintaining or higher subsidies, there's a risk that public spending explodes. And then utilities revenue goes down with regulation. For Switzerland, if we compare the proposed regulation with current incentives with other alternative and more ambitious designs, we find that perhaps an appealing mix could be lower subsidies and higher taxes. First, this can limit cross-subsidization of taxpayer money to increase private property value, and also we see here that it lowers it balances a bit the budget, and of course, yes, the negative part is that private owners have to invest more. There could be also a case for stricter heating bans and retrofit obligations before 2035, and higher taxes, as this leads to the highest emission savings. But of course, this comes at the expense of increased public spending and investment by dwelling owners. The last set of results that we didn't have a lot of time to analyze very in detail, but are the distributional impacts of these policy mixes across the 4 household groups that you can see in the screen. And here we plot the percentage of households within each group that will likely pay more than current costs for heating and electricity, more or less the same, or can even save money. Here we include investment cost, residual value of existing equipment, operation and maintenance costs, and fuel and electricity cost. And an important assumption here also is that we assume landlords can fully pass through the investments to tenants, as Swiss tenancy allows this for this kind of investments that I presented. So this is a worst case scenario for tenants, but we see that compared to no regulation, regulation increases also can increase the long-term cost for heating and electricity of more households, unless, with higher subsidies and exemptions, especially. This is especially positive for people living in flats, and we see for the biggest group of households in Switzerland, that is tenants in flats, that they are more adversely impacted by stricter regulation, by this stricter PV, this obligation to have PV before 2035 with lower subsidies, because then they. And without promoting heat pumps, for instance, so that they can really profit from this early PV. And here, one solution could be to limit this pass-through of investments from landlords to tenants, as anyway this allowance is designed to promote investments from landlords. that otherwise wouldn't be interested, but this can also be done through regulation. And to conclude, regulation can accelerate the decarbonization of the Swiss residential sector. Bans on new oil boilers are key to avoiding their long-term lock-in. Retrofit obligations can drive significant energy savings that would otherwise would not be achieved, as envelope retrofits are perceived as expensive. Then enforcing a PV or enforcing PV before 2035 rather than waiting for the renovation of roof can lead to faster and more widespread solar PV deployment, but complementary policies are necessary to make PV then more attractive and mitigate the potential cost burden for households. The economic impact of these policy mixes is multifaceted and actor-dependent. The construction industry benefits from these increased investments, but they might lead to this is at the cost of dwelling owners and households, and exemption subsidies or limiting the pass-through of investment costs from landlords to tenants could protect vulnerable groups. This has to be further researched. Utilities may face declining revenues, and their revenue stream from district heating becomes more important. And strict regulation can place pressure on public finances if not being careful about subsidies that are in parallel, that are not carefully targeted or time-bound. And as further work, here we consider a homogeneous implicit discount rate, but of course, as we've seen in a presentation before about the investment behavior of homeowners, it's also important to differentiate about how homeowners and landlords invest. This, I think, needs further attention. Also, we could further disaggregate distributional impacts and capture more focus on specific cases of deprivation and how protection measures could really target these groups. Thank you very much.
Two suggestions. First of all, or questions. First suggestion is that ultimate distributional effect depends on who pays the subsidies or who receives the money from the taxes. And that's always rule number one in economics. It's also rule number one whenever you discuss road pricing, anything like that. It's always the first principle. So I suggest that to have a look and say, my results depend on who pays the subsidies. That would be number one. Number two is a suggestion. Maybe I did not understand the whole model, but imagine that I raise prices of energy. If I raise the price of energy, some people that cannot react via more efficient buildings, etc., what they do is they reduce the temperature. Now, of course, it saves them some money, but there is a comfort cost. And the question is, how do you compute this comfort cost? So it's kind of like a consumer surplus of, let's say, what is the loss of consumer surplus whenever you have an increased cost of residential energy. So there are ways to do that. It was not clear how you did that. Oh, you understand my question?
Yeah.
Okay,
I think these are two very good suggestions. I mean, we don't include these intangible costs, nor the additional distributional effects of rising subsidies, because this is only so this is not a general equilibrium model or anything like this.
You can make assumptions. You say, I take assumptions. If the subsidies come from higher income taxes, etc., There are many people that have computed that in the case of Switzerland, I guess. These data exist. And it's interesting because it gives you, it's legitimate, it's a real good question from the public, say, who pays for this? Are only the rich or?
I mean, currently in Switzerland, there's, so most of these subsidies are financed by CO2 tax revenues. So it's the emitters that pay. But yeah.
Okay, but my suggestion is just have a look at that.
Yeah.
That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe just more a little bit on how the model works. Maybe I'm not so familiar or I missed it. So how do the policies interact together when you do the mix? Is this just like additive, or it's actually like a little bit more like rich? So yeah, I think that's mostly my question.
Yeah. So basically, regulation filters out the set of investment options available to each dwelling. So if you're, I don't know, here in 2030, and there's a regulation that says this is the year for you to renovate, you can look at all possible combinations of these kinds of investments, but all of them have to have a retrofit to it. Then, or a ban on oil boilers, then you cannot invest in a new boiler. We compute the annualized costs of every combination of possible investments with this implicit discount rate of 15%, and then we select the one with the minimum costs. And taxes and subsidies are within these cost calculations of every option available.
Thank you. I was just wondering, quick question, if you made some kind of back testing of your model, just to be sure that it's realistic.
We did some, we did some comparison of. We don't empirically validate our results with historical data. We take this empirical based discount rate from a similar model for Switzerland, same types of investments, but it's not historically calibrated. We check that the numbers in our initial years make sense, but we don't empirically, historically calibrate.
But you could do it historically.
Yeah.
With historical data, you could do some back testing, I think.
Thank you very much. We are free to.